I'm thinking of Kris repeating Birdley's name in shock when you try to tell Rousey that you are going to the festival with Birdley of all people. Thinking about the conversations we only get to hear half of, where Kris presumably tells Rousey and Susie that Rousey and Asriel don't look that much alike. Thinking about all the times where Kris changes the prompt we give them into something that they'd prefer to say. Kris talks. They chatter even. But we as the player don't get to hear it. They don't get a text box. We only ever know that they spoke at all from the reactions of other characters. And even then, we rarely know exactly what was said. Part 1. The Facade. When you open a video game and pop the disc into your Nintendo GameCube, you're expecting not just to experience a story like in a novel or film, you're expecting to experience a ride from the driver's seat. No matter how linear a video game is, it's not going to continue unless you make an active choice to continue yourself. So you need a guy to be. Sometimes you're Link. Sometimes you're Samus. Most often, you're Buck Bumble, from the hit classic Buck Bumble. But there's always a guy that you have to be. And this is weird because normally you're you. You're not a guy, you're just you living inside yourself. When you read a book or watch a film, you don't have to be a guy, you can just be you, watching things happen. But when you play Buck Bumble, you're a guy. What about now? It's time to rock with the biggity Buck Bumble. Sometimes in games, when you're a guy, the guy is you, or some approximation of you. In Monster Hunter, the Monster Hunter is you, a virtual version of you that you play to pretend. In Stardew Valley, when you marry Elliot, you're the one he's falling deeply in love with. But other times in games, your guy is not you, he's someone else. In The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, the guy who is you isn't you, the guy is Link. You get to name Link, but Link has feelings pre-decided before you arrive in the world of the game. Link is sad, Link is despondent, he just lost his best friend. In either case, whether your guy is you or not, you're a guy for a while, and usually playing pretend isn't that difficult. All you have to do is pretend that you're Link, sad that you lost your best buddy, and away you go. You've been sad before, right? Just pretend you're sad. Easy. It's not unlike playing with toys. When you play with toys, you're being a guy, you're being the toy. When you control the toy like a puppet, you are that toy in some small way, as if your body is expanding to include the guy. It's the same with games. It doesn't take long before you don't have to look down at the controller to see which button you're pressing anymore. Being a guy becomes second nature. Kris from Deltarune, then, is a toy. A toy you control, a toy you get to play with to experience the world of the game. You pretend to be Kris, a blank slate for you to project onto. You get to decide everything they do, and sometimes the other characters react as if they can hear Kris, like they're reacting to something being said. But that's just a little flavor for the game. Kris is just your toy. But sometimes Kris fights back. They can see the part of you that extends into the game world, represented by the heart-shaped soul. When Kris tears out the soul, we lose control of them until they decide to put it back in. As we know, this is evil. When Kris does this, it cruelly takes control away from the player, and causes us to suddenly become not drivers behind the wheel, but mere passengers. This is unacceptable, however, because we paid $24.99 USD for Deltarune, and Kris knows this, which is why they always put the heart back in their body. They are just a computer program, after all. Toys don't have the right to act on their own, especially when we paid money to have the right to play with them. Kris being evil is further evidenced by the fact that they are clearly working against the player, probably because they're jealous that we get to exist in the real world and they don't. Kris is a blank slate for the player to fill in. Their room in their home is completely empty until the player earns one of Susie's awards in the game, indicating that Kris has no personality on their own. They're also referred to as they in the game, so the player can project whatever gender they want onto Kris, which is a very fun move from Toby Fox. This is how every other game works after all. Even the games that inspired Undertale and Deltarune, like Cave Story, Earthbound, and even Brandish. Blank slates. Silent protagonists. Nobodies. Empty vessels for us to live inside of for a while. Toys for us to play with. If the characters have personalities, we as players are allowed to push them out of the way and impose our wishes on them. And Toby Fox is trying to show us how unpleasant it is for an ungrateful protagonist like Kris to fight against us. Buck Bumble would never.
What about now? It's time to rock with the biggity Buck Bumble.
So, what happens if you just stop moving? In a video game, there are moments when everything is pushing you forward, but as the player, you have the freedom to just stop and sit still. Nothing trying to kill you. Nobody moving you forward. You can just sit there. You could sit there forever, couldn't you? You could leave the game there, get up and leave, come back with a snack. The game can't move forward when you're not playing it. Deltarune isn't on a timer. You can just choose not to progress, to play with whatever limited options you have, to read the same text boxes over and over, and you can do that forever. These are moments that are megalomaniacal, moments where the piece of you that extends to encompass a toy that you're playing with encompasses the entire world of the game. No one can continue without you, and the characters don't even know your name. In these moments, frozen droplets of timelessness, there is a sense of being incomplete. This is not the intended way to play a video game. Video games are all about constant motion, pushing forward, seeking a new path. When a player can't progress due to esoteric level design, the player grows frustrated. But that's strange, isn't it? Idle moments are what most of our lives are about. Human beings wander aimlessly all the time. We read the same signs. We speak to the same people over and over. We don't have that push to move forward. You could argue that the act of playing a video game itself is idle, a completely internal experience. The only evidence of neurons firing at all being the motion of your fingers on the controller. What do you think Kris feels like right now? How does it feel being a toy? You're not supposed to want to relate to a toy, are you? Toys and people are two different classes of being. A toy could never be a person, but could a human become a toy? When you're in any grocery store, you're being watched by innumerable cameras that peer upon you from on high, where computers collect the footage in case you steal anything. Cameras are toys, but they're watching us, playing with us, or at least humans watching the cameras in some small way are playing with us. The cameras watch us like we watch NPCs in video games, with our predictable routines and ordinary repetitive dialogue. What do you think Kris feels like right now? How does it feel being a person being controlled by another person? Kris isn't a person, but they're... When someone opens a video game and pops the disc into their Nintendo GameCube, they're expecting not just to experience a story like in a novel or film, they're expecting to experience a ride from the driver's seat. No matter how linear a video game is, it's not going to continue unless the player makes an active choice to continue for themselves. So they need a puppet. Where can we find a puppet? You'll do nicely. Part 2. Bein Kris. Your name is Kris Dreamer. You were a teenager attending a small school in a town called Hometown. Up until recently, you've lived with your family. Family used to mean yourself, your brother Asriel, your mom Toriel, and your dad Asgore. You always felt like an outsider in your family. They all had white fur and horns, but you're a human, an adopted sibling. Even so, you love your family. Lately, though, it's been getting smaller. Asgore doesn't live with you anymore, and Asriel has left for college. Now it's just you and your mom. You've never been entirely eye to eye with your mom, and even if she tries her best, talking to her these days makes you feel exhausted, especially when she brings friends over. You feel exhausted a lot, your body taking a great deal of effort to move, slouching and shuffling your feet everywhere. You wish there was something out there to give you more energy. Everyone around you is trying their best. Mom is trying to raise you. Your teacher Alphys is doing her best to teach a bunch of rowdy teens. And the people of Hometown are just trying to make a living. You don't think they're doing a very good job, but you don't think that's their fault. Most of the time, you don't care. Your neighbor Noelle is your closest friend, but you feel like even she has become distant lately. You can't blame her. Your lives are meant for two different directions. Hers towards college and a career and a life, and yours is... Recently, you've been using your power. You doze off in class, and sometimes Alphys says you were awake the whole time. Sometimes you realize your hands are moving on their own. You feel like you're light as a feather. The feeling started when you met her, Susie. Then you met him, Ralsei. Then you fell into the dark worlds together, and even if the spaces inside looked bigger in the dark, every moment with them felt like a treasure. That light feeling pervades, the feeling of quiet control, like your body has an autopilot that you can lean back and allow to take over when you're too tired. Even so, sometimes you hear the heartbeat a little too loudly. But something odd has been happening too. Your autopilot seems less like you. You find yourself saying things you don't want to, doing things you wouldn't normally do, like it's not autopilot anymore, just pilot, and the pilot isn't you. Someone behind your eyes. Or maybe high above. So sometimes you tear off the strings to your heartbeat so it can stop. And it does stop. But when it does, you feel so much heavier, so much more empty, and most of all, completely without that bright light feeling. When you see Susie smile at you, a thought strikes you. Is she smiling at you, or is she smiling at your pilot? And then one day, everything just stops. You stop at a save point, a glowing light only you can see, a place the pilot likes to visit. Sometimes the pilot visits them, and you stand there for a long time. But when you get going again, it feels like no time at all. But this time, the stagnant standing is stretching out forever and ever. You look around. Susie stands behind you, and behind her are Ralsei. You call out to them, but their faces are blank, expressionless yet alive, as if their hearts have been torn out. And someday, years after that first lingering save point, that incomplete permanent singularity of time without warning, you simply cease to exist. No explanation, no closure, no reason. It's all just gone. Then the world was covered in darkness.
Why do you give them faces? Try to friendly them all up, make them look all human.
These robots are not susceptible to intimidation.
I guess if you didn't, we wouldn't trust them.
These robots are USR property.
Not me. These things are just lights and clockwork.
Are you crazy?
Deltarune Chapter 2 came out in 2021. That's years ago now. I originally played Deltarune 1 and 2 on a shitty laptop I bought for $100 on eBay, but when Chapters 3 and 4 came out in June, I had to play them on my new PC. I always wondered if the version I left behind felt anything when I finally took apart that old laptop for parts. If the Kris and Susie and Ralsei are the same characters, or if they're new versions of the same people with their own lives to live. Doesn't matter. How many video games do you think never got beaten by the people who play them? Probably, if I were to guess, most of them. I couldn't put a percent on it specifically, but probably more than 60% of games that can be finished just don't. RPGs people lose interest in, platformers that are a little too hard, visual novels that people forget about. I find it interesting to think about. From the perspective of the characters in the games, one day the protagonist just gives up. Ness lets Gygus win, Chrono leaves forever, Mario doesn't rescue the princess. If video games are a multiverse, then only a fleeting number of those multiverses actually achieve victory. And of those, only the most successful version of events gets preserved. If you die, you lose progress. The lost versions of those characters die too. In the Pixar animated film Wreck-It Ralph, we come upon an arcade open for business and explore the lives led by the in-game characters. Because the arcade only has one cabinet of Wreck-It Ralph, we can assume that Ralph, who acts as the protagonist of the movie, is a unique version of Ralph, and that other arcades would have other Ralphs of their own. Perhaps a cabinet owned by a collector would have a Ralph who is very acquainted with his associates. Maybe an abandoned arcade has a Ralph who has been lonely for years. Wreck-It Ralph's scope is very small, but we could imagine hundreds of Ralphs and Sonics and Marios and Tappers and Felixes from all over the world, existing in droves with emergent lives of their own. And just like them, there would be hundreds and thousands of Krises. Wreck-It Ralph explores an interesting vision of death. Near the beginning of the film, an expository Sonic the Hedgehog explains the rules of this universe. That if you die inside your game, you come back, but if you die outside of it, you'll be gone for good. The implications of this are obviously meant to explain why a game character has lives, and to set up the stakes of the film later when Ralph is outside of his own game. But there's one implication that's glossed over. Within the games, these characters are immortal. They cannot die. They exist forever and ever. When we open a game, we consign these characters to a permanent existence. You are responsible for one discrete version of Kris, and if you fail them, they will never know the release of death. I was being facetious earlier. Kris is not a self-insert character. They have dreams and goals and wants that is far beyond our understanding. But if this is true, and Kris is not just our toy and has agency, we should take responsibility for that, shouldn't we? Otherwise, deep down, we believe that they are a toy after all. So the question is, who is Kris Dreamer? Don't touch that dial. Funk McLovin's not going anywhere. First, a word from our sponsor. Before we continue, I'm proud to announce that this video is sponsored by me. That's right, I'm shilling my own music. If I'm gonna sell out, I might as well sell out to myself. Over the last few videos, I've used some of my own remixes of Deltarune music, which people have been asking about in the comments for some time now. Usually when I make essays, I just make these remixes for the essays, and don't really bother releasing the tracks. But because so many people have asked, I'm putting everything on my Bandcamp for free! You can donate now through Bandcamp if you like, but the remixes are available to download for free. My Bandcamp is full of my own original music from as early as 2017, so feel free to poke around. DELTARUNE is now available on Bandcamp at funkmclovin.bandcamp.com/album/dash or in the description of this video. You can also find my blog at patreon.com/funkmclovin, as well as work in progresses, scripts, and other insider information. Please donate to me. I'm trying to get this ship off the ground here. I've been doing YouTube for like 5 years, doing Homestuck shit, and I want to make this airplane actually fly. I think I can do it, and if you do too, give me money, please. Also, like, comment, and subscribe, and of course, don't forget to tickle my balls. Thanks, now back to the video. Part 4. Who is Kris Dreamer? Deltarune doesn't want you to hear Kris's voice. Kris has no sound effects, no voice lines, no dialogue boxes, and the dialogue choices we are able to make for them are never stated by Kris themselves, leaving other characters to occasionally react to the strange way that Kris responds. Sometimes if you choose an out-of-character line from Kris, the other characters are perturbed or confused. Sometimes Kris tries to cover their mouth to prevent our words from leaving. Kris has agency, but the game treats them like a silent protagonist. In this way, we have a character who is not silent. Kris speaks, mumbles, and even shouts, but that information is never given directly to the player. Instead, Kris is silenced. The only time Kris is fully able to make a choice for themselves is when they tear us out of their body and shamble around, trying to work against the player. It looks like it kind of hurts them too. So who is Kris Dreamer? There's clearly a person behind the silence, someone who's screaming to be heard, so let's listen. The shared body. Before discussing Kris, let's discuss how Kris's body works and how we as players share it with them. A central question to all this needs to be answered, and that is, how does Kris feel about being controlled? While your first instinct might be to say that Kris doesn't like the player or that our relationship to them is antagonistic, I don't think this is a safe assumption to make. After all, Kris seems to have agency over whether or not the soul, we, are in them at any given moment. They tear it out during certain important sections, most notably during the Weird Route scene in Chapter 4, where they tear out the heart and stomp on it. The level of control they have over their bodies seems to be very high, except in the case of the Weird Route shenanigans. In this way, I believe that we cannot say for sure whether Kris enjoys being controlled. They clearly tolerate or even allow being controlled. There are many hints that Kris speaks to Ralsei and Noelle when we aren't looking. In Chapter 4, if the player eavesdrops on Noelle and Susie's extended conversation, the player can see Noelle and Susie have very different ideas of who Kris is. Noelle, who has known Kris her whole life, comments that lately Kris is acting differently, whereas Susie notes that Kris seems normal because she has only known Kris for a little while. We can assume that the player acts differently to how Kris normally behaves. The fact that Kris allows the soul to puppet them, combined with Chapter 4's hints that Kris and the Knight are in cahoots, I assume Kris is acting the way they are because it somehow benefits the broader machinations of the Knight, Kris, and Carol to have the soul control Kris for whatever reason. So to summarize, Kris is a person who seems to have, for some greater purpose, allowed a soul into their body for the time being, and at a few critical points they tear out the soul and act on their own, which they can do at will, albeit at pain to themselves. Chapter 1. Let's assume the first time Kris is possessed by the player is the first moment of Chapter 1, where Toriel wakes Kris for school. This seems safe to assume because, well, it's the first part of the game. During Chapter 1, we are not given many hints that Kris is more than what they seem until the end, where they tear out the soul and brandish their iconic Kris knife. There should also be special mention of Kris's relationship to Susie. Kris and the player meet Susie at the same time when Susie bursts into the classroom and later threatens to eat Kris's face. In this way, Susie is a shared friend with Kris and the player. Same goes for Ralsei, but he is slightly different. Over the course of Chapter 1, Kris and the player work together to break down Susie's facade, as well as to progress towards defeating the king. After the defeat of the king, Kris uses the soul to close the fountain. According to Ralsei, Kris is the only one who can close the fountains. More accurately, the soul is the only one who can close the fountains. More on this later. Since Chapter 1 is more focused on Susie's arc, let's move on for now. Chapter 2. At the beginning of Chapter 2, we discover why Kris was brandishing the knife. It wasn't to cause violence at all, but to cut up and consume a pie Toriel made, which she scolds Kris for. This fake-out is interesting to me. What is Toby Fox trying to communicate to the player with this fake-out? Kris's behavior in the Chapter 1 cliffhanger seems to indicate malice or evil, locking the soul in a pre-prepared cage that is shown from the first moments of the game. It's meant to unnerve the player, but at the same time, eating a pie is something very innocuous. Toby is faking us out. Why? Kris is repeatedly shown to have violent or strange tendencies, and I believe Toby's intent is to communicate that while Kris is weird and even violent, they're not a bad person. By faking us out in this way, Toby is saying, look at this scary person, aren't they silly? The same thing happens to Susie in Chapter 1. Scariness is a recurring theme in Deltarune. More on this later. After Chapter 2's events with Queen, Kris in the Light World once again discards the soul and slashes Toriel's tires. While Susie is sleeping over, Kris opens a Dark World in their living room. This is the first hint that Kris is working against the player. In Chapter 2, it is firmly established that Dark Worlds are bad, yet we see Kris opening one. This led to many theories that Kris is the Roaring Knight, the seemingly main antagonist of the story, which was later debunked after Chapter 3's release. However, it's clear that Kris is in some way allied with the Roaring Knight in some heretofore unforeseen capacity. Kris's nature is more easily seen in the Weird Route, however. In Chapter 2, unlike Chapter 1, there are multiple outcomes that depend on player action, namely the Weird Route, formerly known as Snowgrave. This is the first time we can observe Kris resisting the player, but critically this resistance only exists during the Weird Route so far. Chapter 3. Chapter 3 is, so far, the most Kris-focused chapter. There are a few ambiguities in this chapter. Actions taken by Kris to act as architect. Firstly, Kris specifically plugs in the living room TV, aka Tenna. In the game, Tenna often addresses Kris directly, reminiscing about and trying to recapture the days he was used by Kris and their brother Asriel. Kris is also more active in this chapter. During one of Tenna's quiz sections, Kris helps the player by selecting their favorite food as the answer to the quiz. This shows that Kris is still autonomous to some degree, even during the game. During the secret section of Chapter 3, when Kris is playing the video game alone, they flinch when the player makes the game character kill the game versions of Susie and Ralsei. This indicates that Kris, like us, cares about these two very deeply. In this chapter, the player is very aligned with Kris. We feel very similar emotions to what they do, understanding their life a little more. Tenna remarks that slowly, Kris's family is falling apart, something Kris has no doubt taken note of themselves, and they seem genuinely tortured by it. However, in spite of the player's alignment with Kris, there remain some unanswered questions. It's undoubtable that Kris is working somehow with a Roaring Knight. Even they do battle with the Knight in the secret boss section. The Knight needs Toriel for some undefined purpose, and Kris, making the Dark World, made that possible. I'm going to make two assumptions here. I've tried so far to involve little speculation, as Deltarune isn't a completed game, and it's pointless to speculate on a game that is going to eventually be released. So I'm making the smallest leap that I can. Assumption 1 is that Kris loves their mother. It seems as though Kris's relationship is strained with Toriel, but the idea that they would put Toriel in danger is unlikely. Assumption 2 is that if Kris loves Toriel, they would not willingly put her in danger. What we can gather from this is that whatever the Knight was doing to Toriel was not harming her. Kris does not react in a strong fashion when they see their mother captured by Tenna, nor when the Knight is doing whatever it is the Knight is doing to them. This is as opposed to later in Chapter 4 when Kris is being tortured by the old jitterbug. If Kris cares about the person his mother is dating, but not about how the Roaring Knight is treating her, we can assume that whatever was going on was part of some plan. Whatever the case between the Roaring Knight and Kris, I don't believe the Knight is what they seem. The game does want us to believe that the Knight is evil, but remember the Chapter 1 knife fake-out. Toby is trying to tell us that violent-looking people are sometimes more normal than they seem. Chapter 4. Chapter 4 reveals a great deal about Kris, and gives us the first section where we as players are able to view Kris from the outside. When Kris discards the soul, they go into the kitchen to make some chalky milk when they speak to Carol on the phone. This, like the knife pie fake-out, is an indication that Kris is very, shall we say, id-driven. They like treats. Nothing wrong with that. I won't go over every little detail in this chapter for the sake of time, but there are a great deal of moments during the Dark World inside the church where Kris acts out against the player. When the player chooses unpleasant dialogue options, Kris is more vocal about trying to avoid them. Kris also stonewalls the player slightly when it comes to the talents at the piano. During most puzzles, we are forced to clumsily play the piano using the limited keyboard controls, but when Kris takes control, they play beautifully. After the madness with the Titan, Susie and Kris return home, and Kris is subject to the aforementioned jitterbug madness. This could be Kris's most clear character moment so far, the only time they have emoted since Chapter 1's knife pie fake-out. Big picture. To some extent, attempting to analyze Kris Dreamer before the entire story of Deltarune is finished is foolish. This piece is less of a comprehensive character analysis, and more like an attempt to get everyone on the same page about Kris Dreamer before more of the game is released. Based on the surface-level appearance of Kris, it is easy to make 3 wrong assumptions, ones that I believe the fan community as a whole has fallen into. First, that Kris is somehow working against the player. Kris works together with the player, even to defeat the Roaring Knight, and when they tear out their soul, it is only because they want to exercise their autonomy. The only times they grow frustrated with the soul is when the soul chooses dialogue that Kris explicitly disagrees with. There is some animosity and much mystery, but Kris is not our enemy. The only goal they have prevented us from doing is to see the inside of Dessa's guitar. Second, that Kris is a mere puppet or empty vessel that players are able to project onto. This thought is less common, but for unobservant players, it's easy to ignore Kris's agency. Third, that Kris is not real friends with Susie and Ralsei. It's hinted that Kris and Ralsei speak to each other when the player isn't looking. And when the player kills the virtual versions of Susie and Ralsei during Chapter 3, Kris winces in pain. Kris cares for them, deeply. The reason this is important is because this ambiguity is most certainly going to come into play at some point in Deltarune's story. The beginning of the game, originally the survey program, draws parallels with character creation and the act of inhabiting a vessel. Kris has something to do with this. Part 5. Kris, Frisk, and Chara. Frisk, the player character of Undertale, and Kris are meant to be explicit parallels. Kris contains elements of Frisk, such as skin tone, obscured eyes, and a plain expression, but Kris also contains elements from Chara. The differences and similarities between them can show us a lot of what Toby Fox is trying to say about video games and the idea of controlling characters as a whole. First of all, I want to talk about the somewhat distressing difference between Kris and Frisk. Namely, if that Toby Fox is trying to tell us that Kris is their own person even if they're being controlled by a soul, then what does that imply about Frisk? Kris and Frisk. Here's a question. Is the soul in Undertale the same thing as the soul in Deltarune? A soul in Undertale is usually referred to as a human soul. In other words, something every human possesses that enacts its own will. Similarly, monsters have inverted white monster souls that are less powerful but allow monsters to do magic. A soul in Deltarune, however, is something seemingly different. While it is referred to as a human soul numerous times, it's unclear if every human has one. Furthermore, there is no mention of monster souls at all. This creates two possibilities. One is that Undertale and Deltarune souls are different in some way. Kris and Frisk have a different type of soul that acts differently. Toby does say in the Deltarune FAQ that rules may be different between games after all. The second possibility is that the souls are the same and that much like Kris, Frisk's soul is something the player controls within Frisk. If this is true, then Frisk is also a shared body with the player's soul. Does Frisk have a will of their own that we don't see? It seems to me like the answer is somewhere in between. The soul is the thing we control in both games, but Frisk is implied to have a soul before and after the events of the game, whereas Kris gets a soul when we begin the game, during the intro cutscene with the voice. I do believe that this soul dichotomy makes a distressing implication about Frisk, though. The events of the game, in some sense, are not entirely the actions of Frisk themselves, and they have agency and a consciousness beyond what the player can see, meaning if Kris is a silenced protagonist, Frisk is even more silenced. Kris and Chara. A brief recap. Chara, or the fallen human, falls into the underground and is adopted by Asgore, Toriel, and their adopted brother Asriel. Chara takes the name Dreamer. If I pronounce Chara 3 different ways, maybe people will not be pissed off because they'll hear their favorite pronunciation. Just kidding. Asriel and Chara become close, with Asriel seemingly the only person who Chara trusts. Asriel recounts the reason Chara climbed Mount Ebott, not for a happy reason. The 4 dreamers live a seemingly happy life until Chara's inherent violence shows itself. Chara has a dire idea involving Asriel and poisonous buttercup flowers. The barrier between worlds has the power of 7 human souls to overcome, but Chara finds a way to create something more powerful. The combined soul of a monster and a human. So Chara consumed 6 poisonous flowers, Asriel absorbed their soul, and the plan was to kill 6 additional humans to break the barrier once Asriel was able to cross over. Asriel does not like this plan, and it fails, leading to the death of both Chara by poison and Asriel when he attempts to bring Chara's body to the surface and is slain by the humans mistaking it for murder. There is more to Chara, but a child having a plan involving suicide and murder shows Chara's great inner darkness and capacity for violence. They're even said to have laughed off a time when Asgore was poisoned by buttercups. There are obvious parallels between Chara and Kris, such as their status as adopted dreamer humans, as well as their tendency for the macabre. They're also shown to be friends with their version of Asriel. What I believe this is leading us to is some kind of violent plan on the part of Kris. Something dire they have enacted in order that something may be reclaimed. Maybe undoing the death of Des, maybe trying to piece their family back together. It's impossible to say, but Kris, like Chara, is at the heart of the story. Your name is Kris Dreamer. You are a teenager attending a small school in a town called Hometown. Up until recently, you've lived with your family. Family used to mean yourself, your brother Asriel, your mom Toriel, and your dad Asgore. You always felt like an outsider in your family. They all had white fur and horns, but you're a human, an adopted sibling. Even so, you love the family you don't belong to. Lately though, it's been getting smaller. Asgore doesn't live with you anymore, and Asriel's left for college. Now, it's just you and your mom and the specter of your father, trapped in a past you feel slipping through your fingers. You've never seen entirely eye to eye with your mom, and even if she tries her best, talking to her these days makes you feel exhausted, especially when she brings friends over. You feel exhausted a lot, your body empty like a shell or an empty cage, a car with no motor. You wish there was something out there to give you more energy. Everyone around you is trying their best. Mom is trying her best to raise you. Your teacher Alphys is doing her best to teach a bunch of rowdy teens. And the people of Hometown are just trying to make a living. You don't think they're doing a very good job, but you also don't think that's their fault. Most of the time, you don't care. If they disappeared, would you even cry? Your neighbor Noelle was your closest friend, but you feel like even she's been distant lately. You can't blame her. Your lives are meant for two different directions. Hers towards college and a career and a life, and yours towards nothingness. Your life doesn't mean anything. Everything is different now, though, since the soul entered. You doze off in class, and sometimes Alphys says that you were awake the whole time. You let the soul move your hands, and for the first time you feel light as a feather. And then there are your new friends, Susie, Ralsei. Then you fell into the dark worlds together, and even if the spaces inside looked bigger in the dark, every moment with them felt like a treasure. Your life still doesn't mean anything, but you finally found something to enjoy. That light feeling pervades, the feeling of quiet control, like your body has an autopilot that you can lean back and allow to take over when you're too tired. Even so, you sometimes hear the heartbeat a little too loudly. You make it to the end. You see a skeleton dancing with your mother, and you hear a cryptic voice begging you to continue. You know it wasn't over. You know the rest of the story hasn't been written yet. So you wait. You lie in perfect silence and watch the dark world around you, feeling the missing soul in your chest, knowing that somewhere, someday, it will return and make the world bright once again. Maybe then you can find it. Discover it. The thing you've been looking for, the thing no one knows. Deltarune. Alright, that's the end of the video. Again, look at my album, look at my Patreon. The links for those are in the description. Thank you. Have a beautiful day. And I was gonna answer some Patreon questions, but I forgot to actually put the Patreon Q&A thing out, so that's it. Bye.